Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Can Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party lose next year's election? What might he do to prevent that? How nervous is Orbán about Péter's Magyar Tisza party, which is currently leading in the polls? And with the potential win of Andrej Babiš in the Czech elections, and with recent Karol victory in Poland's presidential race, could we be witnessing a more illiberal V4? I discuss all this and more with Geneviève, an analyst at the German Marshall Fund. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. What does the victory of Karol Nawrocki in the Polish presidential elections mean for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, if anything?
I think we can approach this really on two levels, the symbolic and the practical. On the symbolic level, ahead of the Hungarian elections as well, we are about 1 year away from the Hungarian elections. This is a big victory also for Viktor Orbán, who seeks to position himself as one of the leaders of a patriotic revolution, a sovereigntist revolution in Europe. And he sees and also positions Karol Nawrocki and his victory in that context. And as such, he can and he does use this as ammunition to strengthen his own narrative, both towards international partners, but of course also domestically. So in this sense, this is a symbolic victory for Viktor Orbán on the narrative level that he now uses to energize his own base, strengthen support, which has been dropping, and continue the mobilization. In practical terms, however, I think this is another story, and this is a more complex picture. Of course, the role of the Polish president is not solely symbolic, unlike in the case of Hungary. So there is a policy relevance here as well. But with the PO-led coalition government still in power, I think it does not translate automatically into practical gains either within the European Union or in bilateral Polish-Hungarian relations. But this is now framed nonetheless as a success for the patriotic forces in Europe that Viktor Orbán is trying to champion.
Maybe you just answer at least partly my next question, because I wanted to ask, can Karol Nawrocki bring at least Fidesz and PiS closer together despite, for example, different views on Russia? And have you mentioned that in the past, Nawrocki has promised, for example, to oppose NATO membership for Ukraine?
I think in this regard, Nawrocki is not the solution, but he may be a tool to move Fidesz and law and justice somewhat closer together. So I believe the division on Russia still remains, and there are still significant differences in the policy positions of Fidesz, Orbán, and Nawrocki himself. So Nawrocki indeed had the position you mentioned about Ukraine's NATO membership. At the same time, he does still support continued military support for Ukraine, which is not what the Hungarian governing party has been following over the past 3 years. Where there may be some resonance between the two is also the references and thematization of historical grievances in bilateral relations in Ukraine. So I think that is again something where the two can maybe closer or understand each other better, if you will. But the divide is still there, and especially on the sanctions against Russia, I think that's going to be still central. But at the same time, as I said, Orbán does use this as an opportunity to emphasize the shared ideology underlying the relationship between the two parties. And I think we will see more of that in the coming 1 year, especially in the run-up to the Hungarian election. Fidesz will double down on underlying the commonalities, but ultimately I think it's going to depend on how toxic Fidesz's image remains in Poland for law and justice, whether the relations can again be warmed up. We have seen some shifts in also Polish public opinion regarding Ukraine, but not so much that the Hungarian position would be acceptable. At the same time, we should not forget that in the background, relations between Fidesz and Law and Justice are still existent, both on the party level and also between the organizations close to these parties. The toxicity of Fidesz is still there. If you want just a very practical example, the first CPAC Poland was organized between the 2 rounds of the Polish presidential election, and the big foreign European guest was definitely not Orbán, but Simeon from Romania. And the Hungarians were represented on a much, much lower non-party political level by Miklós Szánto from the Center for Fundamental Rights, a co-organizer of the Hungarian CPAC. But at the Hungarian CPAC, we already have seen Mateusz Morawiecki participating. So there is this delicate dance of figuring out how the two parties can cooperate, but I think it's still not there to put it back in the forefront.
But put it very simplistically, Orbán can probably dream a bit about that after Nawrocki's victory, the Donald Tusk government will collapse, there will be a new elections, and law and justice will be back. Yes?
Yes, that is the idea that Orbán has and is hoping for. That's the scenario that he would like to see materialize. And I would expect that Fidesz would be very supportive of law and justice. And I don't think that law and justice would refuse that type of maybe behind the scenes, but still support from the Hungarian governing party.
So with Viktor Orbán still being a prime minister, with Nawrocki's victory, with Robert Fico's government in Slovakia, and with the expected victory of Andrej Babiš in Czechia, are we looking at more illiberal V4 that can also play, at least partly, a substantial role in European politics?
Well, the rising headcount of illiberals in executive position would suggest that. I think the Hungarian elections will be crucial. And if you look at the timeline, indeed, the Czech elections are coming up in the autumn. Then we have the Hungarian ones in the spring. That's going to be decisive, I believe, in whether or not we have headcount tilting towards the liberals, obviously. I think it's fairly likely that Andrej Babiš is going to come out victorious from the autumn elections. So if the Hungarian governing party manages to win in the spring, then we would have 3 illiberal governments in power. Now about the influence, I think it's a particularly sensitive period because we are just entering the phase of the negotiations of the next multi-annual financial framework. So this is a time when a united illiberal front could have an influence also on the allocation of budgetary resources for the next 7 years. And because of this, the Hungarian election will really be important because the negotiations will close some time after the election. So whether that influence can really materialize, I think 3 governments are not yet enough. But there are pressures in, for example, fields of supporting civil society, democracy within the EU, where not only them, but also some centrist forces are pushing in directions away from the current setup. So I think it's a more complex interplay, and where we would see direct impact is more in the areas where unanimity is still needed, not necessarily where a qualified majority can outcrowd illiberals. But what I think we are actually witnessing is that Central Europe is kind of turning into a battleground between pro-democratic, pro-EU forces, progressive forces, and illiberal nationalist sovereigntist forces, which is quite striking given that this is the part of Europe that has most recently joined a European Union it negotiated its way into as well. So that's, I think, a particularly interesting development. Maybe one more thought on this. The impact on the EU is, of course, crucial, but the rise of illiberal forces in the region is actually having direct impact on the domestic democratic development of these countries, and a negative one, obviously. And we then face a situation where the European institutions are not faced with one country challenging the democratic foundations of the EU, but potentially multiple. And we do see signs of that in Slovakia with the recent foreign agent law as well. So these trends will mean that the matters of domestic democracy, the matters of democratic quality domestically in the EU will be more prominent on the European agenda in the future.
But we would really, because you mentioned the negotiations, the MFF negotiations, and basically in this process you need everybody on board. So do you think that, and we have heard quite tough words, for example, from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, but I still have a feeling that because of those negotiations, countries like Hungary and Slovakia might be somehow be shielded from the real pushback from the Commission or from Berlin and so on. How do you see this?
That's a fair point. And whether financial backing for such an agenda will be there, that's questionable. But I think what is not is that the EU institutions, including the Council, not just the Commission, will need to prepare for a situation where illiberal forces will instrumentalize in transactional ways European decision-making processes. And in that regard, I think it is going to be more in the forefront. We do see that, we will talk about that potentially later with the Hungarian developments domestically. There is also increasing frustration about how to deal with the anti-democratic authoritarian shifts in the country, which are not only domestic problems because they do challenge the authority of European institutions, EU law, and can spill over. But of course, in the case of Hungary, the constant veto threats about Ukraine are also in the cards. So such trends that we see from illiberal forces will need to have answers. And you are very right about the negotiations, and I think this actually underlines that the window of opportunity is small and might be closing.
We mentioned Ukraine a couple of times, and we have seen a series of mutual accusations of espionage between Budapest and Kyiv. Kind of a strange story, maybe. How do you assess this affair?
Yeah, well, quite unprecedented and very serious. But it needs to be also looked at in the context of a very steadily deteriorating bilateral relationship between Hungary and Ukraine, I would say, not even only over the past 3 years, but since 2017. Going back to where it started, the Ukrainian allegations about a spy network operating, Hungarian spy network operating in Ukraine, collecting intelligence on air defense sites, troop movements, and so on and so forth. If true, then the collection of such information primarily would serve Russian interests, which then, again, is true, does not, to put it mildly, increase trust in the Hungarian government and the Hungarian intelligence services and so on. Not just in the eyes of Ukraine, obviously, but also in the eyes of Hungary's allies. And this is a very serious situation, given that there have been previous allegations also about Russia having gained access to the foreign ministry's information systems, and that going publicly quite insufficiently addressed by the Hungarian government. So it's definitely a very bad look for the Hungarian government, but actually going public with this is also a political move by Ukraine, by which the Ukrainian government is actually seeking to send both a message to the Hungarian government that has over the past 3 years been really following an obstructionist position towards Ukraine. And this also increases the political costs of that behavior for Hungary. So with this move, the Ukrainian government actually is also showing strength to the Hungarian government and is pushing back. And it's doing so at a time when the Hungarian government has just started a strong anti-Ukrainian campaign under the so-called Vox 2025, in which we effectively see an EU government actively campaigning against the membership of a candidate country domestically. That is also unprecedented. So ultimately, we have the spy story there, we have the espionage allegations that are also being instrumentalized in a political conflict between the two parties, and ultimately resulting in the lowest of the bilateral relations in modern history of the two countries.
So let's look at the internal situation in Hungary. As we said, Hungarian parliamentary elections will take place in less than 1 year, and Péter Magyar's Tisza party is leading in the polls, in the most polls. How significant is it, and how nervous is Prime Minister Orbán about it?
Well, a short answer to both of your questions is very. It is very significant, and the governing party seems to be very nervous. This is the first time that there is one single challenger in the opposition that actually in durable manner manages to take the lead from the governing party. And we shouldn't forget the fact that this is a new force. So this has been built up within a year. Obviously, this reflects on many things and not just on the political talent of Péter Magyar. But yeah, this created an unprecedented situation that challenges the narrative that there is no other force in the country that may have the public backing and the political power to be elected and govern. So that's a significant shift. And I think this also trickles down to a wider public that may have already started to give up hope for a change, who may be more apolitical while not supporting the government, and wider public being mobilized behind this new force. So it's significant. The nervousness is showing in a very swift escalation in both the activities and the narrative of the governing party. So a narrative has shifted to a very confrontative and dehumanizing tone in the early spring that I think may have overshot. And it seems that the government did step back, at least from the dehumanizing language of calling those who are critical of it essentially bugs that survived too long. I think that was something that didn't fly well in the wider public. maybe potentially even among Fidesz supporters. And then we see the radicalization and escalation of pressure on civil society, on media, the latest amendment, the 15th in 15 years of the constitution, the fundamental law of the country, is now allowing for the suspension of citizenship of dual citizens, whatever that may even mean, who are deemed threat to national security, again, whatever that may even mean, because of course these new legislation and amendments operate with very unclear, flexible terms. We see the so-called transparency law that seeks to starve civil society and the independent media that may receive funding also from abroad, including from EU sources. And the vote on that seems to be put off until the autumn, maybe. So this to me indicates that the government is very nervous, and it is seeing that if all things remain equal, it could actually lose the election.
But could it really? Because so many people would say that, okay.
That's why I'm saying all things being equal.
Yeah, so that many people simply are saying that, that Orbán established a system, created a system in which he cannot lose. Is this real challenger? Is this a real challenger?
First, on the elections. So, of course, as long as Orbán has the 2/3 constitutional majority, he can change whatever he wants. And that's why I think that even in the next 1 year, we have to be prepared for the governing party yet again changing the electoral code, introducing potential new hurdles. We have seen that ahead of every single parliamentary election since 2010, with 2013 being the first time when a completely new electoral system was just introduced that favored Fidesz. So that's in the cards, and that means that under the current circumstances, the opposition can prepare for one thing, but we never know whether that's going to be how elections play out. Of course, there's also the media dominance that creates an unequal playing field, tilting very much towards the governing party. But we do see also a sustained mobilization. Of course, whether it translates into action day mobilization and really lasting structures is something that Tisza is yet to work on. But it seems that the party is sustainably leading in the polls. So this, to me, means that pretty much whatever Fidesz does really serves the purpose of the party remaining in power, whether that's foreign policy or domestic. It will do whatever it can to retain its dominance and ideally constitutional majority in the parliament. We can expect electoral tinkering. We do see the increasing pressure, political pressure also on key figures of the opposition party, Magyar and Rusin-Sandy, who became a public face after having been fired from the Ministry of Defense last year, entering politics this year. And I think the escalation of tactics and instruments are to be expected. That's just in the run-up. Then if Fidesz ultimately manages to win the election, then no problem. If it loses the election, despite everything, then there's still the system. Now, then the question is whether a new opposition, so in that case in government, would play by Fidesz's rules or not. And there may be a calculation in Fidesz that it may not. And I think the governing party now does fear the consequences of that.
So to wrap it up, and I don't want to go into apocalyptic scenarios, but somehow we are living in the world when apocalyptic scenarios are somehow on the table. So can you imagine a situation where Orbán and the system, judicial system basically, he still controls, or at least partly controls, dismiss the result of the elections if Tisza wins?
I would not exclude it. But I don't think that's going to be the most likely scenario. And I think Fidesz and the government, though the two are obviously the same, will try to prevent that scenario. And that's why I think we will see much more effort in the run-up to the election to ensure that Fidesz wins in whatever way, whether that's electoral tinkering or media or political pressure on the opposition. We should also pay attention, by the way, to election day manipulation, precisely because this election will be of such high stakes. So electoral integrity on election day will be crucial, and the full-scale election observation mission would be absolutely justified under the current circumstances. Also, precisely to prevent such a scenario where a governing party could just, for whatever reason, in cooperation with judiciary, and the election. But would I completely exclude that scenario at this point? No, precisely because the stakes are so high. But annulling the election with this background, seeing a really steady, organically growing support for an opposition force is not the Romania scenario. So that would come with immense political costs. And I don't think it would just be political. I think it would also be civil costs. I don't think that Hungarian citizens would stomach that. And should the government go that way, having seen that indeed there has been growing support for an opposition, having records of growing discontent domestically about the situation in Hungary, that would essentially be an authoritarian move that would push Hungary from being a hybrid regime or electoral autocracy, or however you want to call it, into the domain of authoritarianism as such. So that would be a very, very risky move. And I'm not sure that the government would very easily get away with that, especially within the European Union.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.